Welcome to the second video for the second unit. Remember that main idea 2 goes along with video 2 on unit 2. And you also have your notes to help you guide through this video, as well as these 5 questions that you can do as we go, or you can do at the end, whichever you choose. Let's get started. In this second video, we are going to go over the social differences between the 3 different types of colonies and a few of the different moving parts that we see in the colonies at the beginning. Remember, we had the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. The New England colonies are going to be Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. When we think of these colonies, where they're at up here, they are going to be all along the water. Not that they all aren't, but these are going to be the trade center of the colonies. They are also going to be known for their rocky land makeup, which makes it very difficult to have large plantations, which we would find in the southern colonies. Not to say they couldn't farm at all, but their farming practices in the New England colonies were not the same as the South. And remember, we have the middle colonies, also known as the breadbasket colonies in the middle. When we talk social differences and we look at the New England colonies, remember they were established by the Puritans. The Puritans looking to purify the Church of England, being unhappy with the changes that the church had been making and wanting to prove that they could live a morally sound life in the New World, and that if you lived a moral life, you would be successful. Now, because of their dedication to their religion, they are not going to be tolerant of different religions coming in. And within the New England colonies, the only religious tolerant colony is Rhode Island. Rhode Island is where they would send anyone who followed any other religion as kind of a collect-all colony. The middle colonies are going to be the most diverse of all the colonies. They will be tolerant of all religions. You guys may remember that Pennsylvania is known for their Quakers, which were a peaceful group of people. The southern colonies, known for their agriculture, marked by their dependency on slave labor. When we look at these, though, I want to focus just a tiny bit on Georgia. Georgia being the buffer colony, separating the cash colonies, the cash crop colonies of the Carolinas from Florida. Florida at this time was occupied by the Spanish Empire, and the threat of having another empire that close allowed for Georgia to be a buffer. There was also a use of Georgia as a debtors' colony, where some prisoners from England were sent to work off their labors. Now, triangular trade you may remember from global class, and the colonies were a participant in the triangular trade. So when we look at this, we are going to see, and we have to remember that in 1619 in the Jamestown, Virginia colony is when slaves first arrived in the colony. So that is very early on. And this begins to solve the problem of the labor issue in the southern colonies where the plantations are, and begins the dependency on slavery of the economy of the southern colonies. So how does this triangular trade work? Well, you have Europe trading to Africa, and Europe is giving Africa or trading in Africa manufactured goods. And on here you can see the red is England and Europe. So from England and Europe to Africa, we are seeing manufactured goods be traded. From Africa to Europe are going to be enslaved Africans. Now, the yellow is the African trade, what is coming from Africa, and that is slaves and gold. From the colonies to Africa, you're going to see colonial goods, more of those manufactured goods or the materials needed for manufactured goods. And then from Africa to the colonies, you're seeing enslaved Africans. And that's this route here is where we know the Middle Passage, and I know you guys studied that quite a bit. But we also have to look at this piece here between the colonies and England, the colonies and Europe. So when we look at this, we are going to see from the colonies to England are those raw materials, tobacco, lumber, whale oil, fish. And then from England to the colonies are the manufactured goods. They take what the colonies provide them and make goods, then sell them back to the colonies. And you're seeing things like teas, spices, furniture, cloth, tools coming from England going back to the colonies. So this triangular trade really it encapsulated everybody and was taking from each place what they had to offer, what best they had to offer, and giving back any goods that was needed. So Africa needed those manufactured goods. The colonies needed the slaves. England needed the raw materials, and vice versa. When we look at other sources of labor in the colonies, we see the term indentured servants. Now, you know what servant means, but what does indentured mean? These servants are going to be poor immigrants who wanted to come to the New World but could not afford to do so. So, in exchange for a passage, ride on one of the ships to get to the colonies, they will agree to work for a period of time for a wealthy person in the colonies for no wages. So you say, yes, I will take the free ride and I will work for you for the time of 4 to 7 years, 5 to 7 years, and during that time, the servant is provided with shelter, food, and clothing, although these are the very bare minimum. It's not like they're living in the Taj Mahal. It's not like they're being given the best silks and being fed the biggest meals. No, they're provided with what they need to survive, barely survive, during this period of 5 to 7 years. They are not receiving wages, and if they survive their time as an indentured servant, they would be given their freedom. They would be sent off occasionally with some necessities to start a new life. In the very lucky scenario, some were even provided with a portion of land. But indentured servitude was a way for poor immigrants to come here. It was a contract made for people to come to the New World who could not afford it. Now, in the last video, I mentioned the idea of mercantilism. Mercantilism, let's get a definition down. This is when a nation or an empire builds wealth and power by developing industries and exporting manufactured goods in exchange for raw materials in new lands. So the best way, the best example of this is England and the colonies. This was the ultimate goal of empires like England, like Spain, like Portugal, and the 13 colonies were the ideal fit here. This economic system was built on the idea that an empire could build its wealth by expanding into new lands that offered new materials instead of buying that from a competing empire, you could just take it from your colonies. So the goal of mercantilism was to minimize trade with rival empires and instead just focus on establishing colonies. England fits ideal into this with the colonies because the colonies offered up so many different markets. The New England colonies, the middle colonies, the southern colonies, they each had their own specialty. The New England colonies having access to the fish, the middle colonies having access to the lumber, the southern colonies having access to grow tobacco. Each of those offers up something that England could not do on its own, did not have by itself. England's an island. You can only do so much there. The climate there isn't a huge variety in the climate from one part to the next, but in the colonies from New England to southern, the climate is completely different. So when we look at the system of mercantilism, you have a mother country, which in this case would be England, and you have a colony, which is the 13 colonies. From the mother country to the colonies, you are going to see manufactured goods be sold at a high price. From the colonies to the mother country, you are going to see raw materials provided for a cheap price, and you're going to see cheap labor being performed in the colonies. Here, it seems obvious that the mother country is benefiting the most from this relationship. And as we move through, we're going to see this relationship change between the colonies and the mother country, where the colonies are not going to be too happy about the position that they are in. Couple of important colonial figures, and then we're moving on. When we look at important colonial figures, John Peter Zenger needs to set off lights in your brain. John Peter Zenger was the editor of the New York Weekly Journal. He printed an article about a corrupt royal governor. Now remember, royal governors were put in place by the crown. They received their funding, their power really from the colonial assemblies. Now, because the crown was so far away from the royal governors, there wasn't really a whole lot of backup there. And if the colonial assembly liked the royal governor, then that relationship was successful. But in this case, when an article is released about the royal governor William S. Cosby, cue the joke for Bill Cosby, we are going to see a little bit of turbulence here. Cosby was accused of corrupt practices, and nothing gets the people angrier than a corrupt government official. Now, Cosby is going to say, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, and accuse John Peter Zenger of libel. And what this does is he tries to say that what was printed was wrong, it was a lie, it's defamation of his character, and that printing information that opposes the government or puts the government in a bad situation should not be allowed. And when we look at the case of John Peter Zenger, he really brings about this idea that the press should be allowed to print the truth or their view of the truth to best inform the people. Now, John Peter Zenger is found not guilty, and this significance here is the establishment of freedom of the press, which we know is the First Amendment. So even in the colonies, the idea that the press should be allowed to print what they would like without restriction is established. This is huge. The other important colonial figure that we need to recognize because of their future impact on the United States is Benjamin Franklin. He was a writer. He wrote under the name Silence Dogood. He also ran a printing press business. He was a key figure in developing the postal system, and he's going to be a delegate, a representative at the Constitutional Convention. He will be incredibly impactful at the Constitutional Convention because of his well-traveled background. He is very well tuned in what other countries have been doing for their government, and he brings a very unique uh, perspective to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where he will play a leading role. And one more note to add, he was elected president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting Abolition of Slavery, which is huge because we know that when the Constitution was passed, we had to make a compromise for slavery, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that compromise was between the northern states, some of which had completely abolished or gotten rid of slavery, the slave trade, and the southern states who were heavily dependent on slavery and the slave trade. So Benjamin Franklin, a little bit ahead of his time there, pushing for the abolition of slavery beyond just stopping the slave trade in the northern states as he was. Now, remember, you have to finish your main idea number 2 worksheet, 5 questions. Use your notes to help you out. Any questions, contact